No one paid attention to the woman standing near the edge of the desert pavilion. Around her, glass walls reflected sunlight. Investors laughed. Deals were toasted. Numbers flew freely through the air. She wore a faded safety jacket, the kind people stop seeing after a while. No badge, no introduction. No one asked why she was there. What they didn't realize was simple. The moment they stopped paying attention was the moment the system started paying attention to them. Stay with this story. Like, share, and subscribe, because this one ends very differently than you expect. They didn't ask Evelyn why she was there. They didn't ask what she did or who she represented. They glanced at the safety jacket, the scuffed boots, the way she stood slightly off to the side of the display floor, and their eyes moved on. That was the decision. Once people decide you don't matter, they stop editing themselves around you. Evelyn noticed it immediately. Not with surprise, with recognition. She had walked into rooms like this before. Different cities, different industries, same pattern. The louder the confidence, the sloppier the discipline. She didn't correct anyone. She didn't explain that she wasn't part of the technical crew. She didn't adjust her posture to look more important. She stood where she was. When people believe you're invisible, they speak freely. They stop choosing their words. They stop checking who might be listening. That's when the truth gets careless. 3 rows over, a group of executives leaned in over a scale model of a solar facility. They talked numbers first, always numbers first. Projected output, timelines, incentives. Then the language shifted, not dramatically, just enough. A sentence that started with, "We'll clean that up later." A laugh that followed, a little too fast. A comment about reports being flexible depending on who's reviewing them. No one lowered their voice. Why would they? To them. Evelyn was just another body passing through, a background object, part of the room, and rooms have ears. Here's something most people don't realize until they've seen it up close. The people with real power rarely get their information from the top. They don't rely on boardroom summaries or polished decks. They listen to what's said when no one thinks they're being evaluated. In every system, corporations, governments, families, the most accurate version of the truth leaks downward. Not because people at the bottom know more, but because they don't need to perform. When you don't think someone matters, you don't lie to them, you don't posture, you don't protect your image, you just talk. That's why experienced leaders ask the security guard how things are running before they ask the director. It's why they notice who cleans up after meetings, who stays late, who hears the side comments that never make it into reports. Evelyn had learned this lesson a long time ago, back when she was the one people spoke around instead of to. She shifted her weight slightly, as if checking the placement of a display panel. No rush, no tension. Across the hall, someone mentioned permits. Another voice answered with confidence, too quickly. Already handled. Handled how? That question wasn't asked out loud. It didn't need to be, because someone else filled the silence with a detail they shouldn't have shared. A shortcut, a missing step, a report that had been streamlined. That word again, streamlined. Evelyn didn't write anything down. She didn't need to. Years of work had trained her to recognize patterns the way other people recognize faces. This wasn't a single mistake. It was a habit. And habits leave trails. What most people call confidence is often just familiarity with getting away with things. When no one challenges you for long enough, you start confusing luck with competence. That's when people talk too much. A woman nearby joked about regulators being months behind anyway. Someone else added that by the time anyone noticed, the project would be untouchable. They laughed. Evelyn didn't. She adjusted the strap of her jacket and took one slow step forward, just close enough to hear the next sentence clearly. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse than that. It was precise. Names, dates, a reference to a secondary report that never needed to be submitted. That was the moment, not the climax, not the reveal. The moment the system quietly acknowledged her presence, because while the people around her were speaking in assumptions, Evelyn was listening in documentation. She didn't need outrage. She didn't need confrontation. She needed consistency. Truth doesn't collapse systems on its own. Records do. Most people think power announces itself, that it arrives with authority, titles, and raised voices. But real power accumulates quietly. It waits. It listens. It lets people underestimate it. Evelyn had no interest in correcting their perception. Perception is temporary. Evidence isn't. She glanced at her watch not because she was impatient, but because timing matters. It always has. Somewhere across the room, Lucas was explaining a display to a group of attendees. His voice carried just enough to sound confident, not enough to draw attention. She caught his eye for half a second. No signal, no instruction, just confirmation. The truth was already speaking. All she had to do was keep letting it talk, so she stayed exactly where she was. They arrived together, right on schedule. The Holloways didn't scan the room. They assumed it belonged to them. Their names moved faster than they did. People turned before introductions were finished. Hands extended early. Smiles settled into place like muscle memory. This wasn't confidence. It was expectation. They stopped near the center display steel beams, polished renderings, numbers glowing on a screen. One of them tapped the glass lightly, like you would a fish tank. "This is the flagship," he said, not explaining, declaring. They talked about land the way people talk about furniture, acquired, repositioned, improved. No mention of what had been there before. Someone asked about timelines. Another asked about permits. The answers came quickly, too quickly. We streamlined that part. Old requirements, updated process, a shrug, a smile. I noticed how often they laughed right after certain sentences. Not because something was funny, because laughter blurs edges. Behind them, a young woman stood holding a tablet against her chest. Mia Thompson. She didn't interrupt. She waited. She had been waiting most of the afternoon. I recognized the posture immediately. Straight spine, still shoulders, eyes alert, but cautious. That's not insecurity. That's someone trained not to take up space. One of the Holloways gestured vaguely in her direction without looking. She's been helping with the data side. Helping. Mia stepped forward half a step, then stopped herself. Her mouth opened, closed. The conversation had already moved on. They were talking about expansion now. A second site. Different county, different water table, same model. One of them said, "Just adjust the inputs." Adjust? I watched Mia's fingers tighten slightly around the tablet. No one else did. Someone mentioned environmental thresholds. A brief pause. Just long enough to register. Then another voice cut in. "Those numbers are conservative anyway." Conservative. It's interesting which words get used when people think they're safe. Not lies, not outright falsehoods, just soft language that gives cover. They spoke about reports the way gamblers talk about odds, confident, casual, detached from consequence. One of them leaned in closer to the screen. Worst case. We file an amended summary later. Later. That word landed heavier than the rest. Mia shifted her weight. Just slightly. She looked toward the display, then toward the exits. She wasn't deciding whether to speak. She already knew she wouldn't. Because people like her don't get rewarded for being right. They get labeled difficult. I had seen it before. Bright minds filtered out not because they lacked ability, but because they didn't fit the rhythm of entitlement. The Holloways kept talking. They joked about how long reviews actually take, how oversight lags behind innovation, how by the time anyone notices, momentum does the rest of the work. Momentum. That's what people call it when systems fail slowly. I didn't react. I didn't need to. I watched how easily the details slipped out once they felt unobserved. 2 sites, 2 sets of numbers, one version that traveled, one that stayed buried. No one lowered their voice. Why would they? To them. The room was filled with allies, admirers, and background noise. People who served coffee, people who carried tablets, people who listened without consequence. I caught Mia's eye for a fraction of a second. Not reassurance, not instruction, recognition. She looked away first. Across the floor, someone congratulated the Holloways on their foresight, their vision. They accepted it the way people accept things they believe are owed. I took a step closer, not into the circle, just nearer to the sound. Close enough to hear the next sentence clearly. It was said lightly, almost proudly. "We've done this before." That was the sentence that mattered. Not the insults, not the arrogance, the repetition. That's how privilege gives itself away, not through cruelty, but through pattern. Because when you've never been held accountable, you stop thinking of rules as boundaries. They become suggestions, negotiations, delays. Mia finally spoke, not loudly, not emotionally. She corrected a figure, just one. The air changed. One of the Holloways smiled at her, thin and patient. "We'll circle back to that. Circle back." She nodded, stepped back, disappeared again. The conversation resumed as if nothing had happened, because to them, nothing had. But something had shifted. They had crossed from careless into comfortable, from guarded into generous with the truth. And once people start giving like that, they rarely know when to stop. I didn't write anything down. I didn't need to. This wasn't information you chase. It was information you let come to you. The Holloways kept talking about growth, about scale, about how easy it is to move fast when no one slows you down. They were right about one thing. No one was slowing them down. Not yet. But systems don't forget patterns. They record them. And every word spoken without restraint adds weight to the record. Mia stood quietly at the edge of the circle, holding data no one wanted to hear. The Holloways stood at the center, giving away far more than they realized. That's how escalation begins. Not with a confrontation, but with people saying exactly what they believe because they think no one important is listening. Lucas saw it from across the floor, not the whole scene at once. Just the small pieces that told the truth, a hand snapping for attention, a smile that didn't reach the eyes, a sentence delivered like an order, not a request. And his mother, Evelyn, standing there in that faded safety jacket, holding her place without asking for permission. He didn't move right away. If you're watching this and your first thought is, why didn't he step in? I understand that. Because most of us grew up believing love is loud, love is immediate, love is protective and public. But Lucas didn't grow up with most mothers. He grew up with a woman who never raised her voice to prove she was right. She didn't teach him to win arguments. She taught him to read rooms. 10 years earlier, when Lucas was still in high school, he came home furious after a teacher accused him of cheating. He had slammed his backpack on the kitchen floor and said, "I want you to call them right now. I want you to tell them they're wrong." Evelyn had rinsed her hands, dried them carefully, and looked at him like she was measuring the weight of his anger. Then she asked one question. "Do you want to feel better tonight?" she said. "Or do you want to be cleared forever?" That was her style. Not comfort first, clarity first. She drove him to school the next morning, not to argue, to request the testing logs, the seating chart, the proctor notes. She didn't accuse anyone. She asked for records. The accusation disappeared within a week. Not because she demanded respect, because she made it impossible to maintain a lie. Lucas never forgot that lesson. So when he saw his mother being treated like part of the staff, something in him wanted to surge forward. It would have been easy, a sharp word, a public correction, a scene. But Lucas had already seen Evelyn's face. Not humiliation, not panic, focus. He knew that look. It was the same look she wore when she listened to people talk themselves into trouble, the same calm stillness that made confident men start talking faster. And Lucas understood, in that instant, that if he rushed in now, he wouldn't be saving her. He'd be interrupting her. He turned slightly, pretending to adjust the wireless mic pack on the back of his collar. A small movement, a signal to himself to stay steady. Across the room, someone from the Holloway circle said something that made a few people laugh. Lucas couldn't hear every word, but he saw the direction of the laughter. At Evelyn, and that's the moment most people expect the sun to snap. To storm across the floor, to announce who she is. But Lucas didn't, because he knew something the Holloways didn't. His mother didn't need rescuing from discomfort. She had survived harder rooms than this, and she didn't step into those rooms to be liked. She stepped into them to understand. Lucas kept his hands at his sides. His jaw didn't clench. His face stayed neutral, not because it didn't affect him, because he was choosing what to do with it. He watched Evelyn lift her chin just slightly, barely noticeable unless you knew her. Not defiance, alignment. Like she was locking something into place internally. And Lucas remembered another moment. 3 years ago, after his first internship, he came home talking about office politics like it was a new species. He had said, "I can't stand how fake people are." Everyone smiles, then tears each other down later. Evelyn had been quiet, peeling an orange at the counter. Then she said, "People perform when they think performance is the only currency." He'd laughed. "So what do you do?" She didn't look up. "You listen," she said, "and you document, and you choose your moment." That was always it. Choose your moment. Lucas understood that if he confronted the Holloways now, they'd pivot, they'd polish, they'd deny, they'd switch into their public faces, they'd become careful. and careful people don't reveal the truth. Lucas didn't want an apology. He didn't want them to feel bad. He wanted them to be seen, fully. So he did something that looked like nothing. He stayed. He continued his role at the exhibit, explaining the displays to visitors who wandered up, answering surface questions, smiling politely, and all the while, he kept Evelyn in his peripheral vision. He watched how people treated her when they thought she couldn't affect them. He watched which comments were said with ease, which ones were said with a glance around. He watched Mia too, because Mia kept hovering near the edge of the Holloways, like she was tethered there by obligation, a young professional with a tablet and no permission to speak. Lucas made a note of that. Not in a phone, not in a notebook, in his head. Mia's posture said she had answers. The Holloways' posture said they didn't care. Lucas shifted his stance again, moving one step closer to a presentation station. He touched the remote in his hand, clicked once, and advanced the display screen like nothing mattered. But he was watching everything. And then Evelyn looked up, not at the Holloways, at Lucas. One glance, no plea, no instruction, no question, just a steady confirmation, the kind that says, "Stay with me." Lucas exhaled slowly through his nose. This was the part that looks like weakness from the outside. But if you've ever trusted someone who has been through more than you know what it feels like. It's not passive. It's disciplined. It's saying, I don't need to be the hero in this moment, because I'm standing beside the person who knows how to end it. Lucas didn't step in. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand respect. He did something harder. He held his position because he understood something most people learn too late. Sometimes the worst thing you can do in a power game is reveal your strength too early. And his mother had never taught him to win the moment. She taught him to win the outcome. The shift didn't happen with a confrontation. It happened with a click. Lucas stepped forward, calm, measured, exactly on cue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for attention. He simply did his job. Before we move on, he said, gesturing toward the screen, I'd like to walk everyone through the updated performance summary. This is the version that went through final review. Final review. He pressed the remote once. The screen changed. At first, nothing looked different. Same charts. Same color palette. Same clean design. People relaxed. That's the thing about systems they don't announce when they're about to matter. They look ordinary right up until they aren't. Lucas continued speaking, his tone neutral, almost technical. These figures reflect site conditions across both locations, he said, including environmental thresholds. Thresholds. Someone from the Holloways leaned forward slightly. Just curiosity, nothing more. Lucas clicked again. A second set of numbers appeared beneath the first. Smaller font, different notation. He didn't explain the difference right away. He paused, long enough for the room to notice there was something to explain. These are the original projections, he said, filed during the early feasibility phase. Another click. And these, he continued, are the revised values submitted afterward. Submitted. A word that carries weight when used correctly. I watched faces shift not dramatically, just subtly. Brows tightening, smiles holding a fraction longer than necessary. Lucas didn't look at anyone in particular. He spoke to the screen. The methodology didn't change, he said, but the inputs did. He let that sentence sit. Most people think power shows up as authority. In rooms like this, it shows up as comparison. Lucas pointed to a column highlighted in gray. This adjustment alone changes the runoff classification. Someone cleared their throat. Another voice chimed in. Casual. Those margins are within acceptable variance. Lucas nodded once. They are, he said. In isolation. Then he clicked again. A new slide appeared. Same data, different framing. This, he said, is what happens when you apply the same adjustment across both sites. The numbers stacked. Patterns emerged. No accusations, no emotion, just alignment. The Holloways were quiet now, not defensive, alert. Lucas turned slightly, as if addressing a technical question that hadn't been asked yet. Individually, each revision looks reasonable, he said, but taken together, they form a consistent deviation. Deviation. That word landed. Someone in the back shifted their stance. A partner whispered something under their breath. Lucas kept going. This version was flagged during review, he said. Not rejected. Flagged. Flagged means someone noticed. Noticed means someone asked. Asked means there's a record. I saw it then, the moment when confidence gave way to calculation. One of the Holloways smiled, thin but controlled. Can we take this offline? He said. Lucas didn't respond right away. He looked down at the remote in his hand, as if checking which slide came next. Then he clicked. The final screen came up. A summary table. Dates. Submission IDs. Reviewer initials. Nothing dramatic. Just complete. This is the version that cleared compliance. Lucas said. After review. After. The word matters. No one laughed now. This is the part movies usually get wrong. They expect a gasp, a shout, a public collapse. That's not how serious systems work. They don't react loudly. They tighten. I felt it in the room, the pressure shifting from emotion to consequence. One of the Holloways spoke again, slower this time. There must be some misunderstanding. Lucas nodded. That's why documentation exists, he said. Simple, unarguable. He wasn't challenging them. He was placing the burden where it belonged. On the record, I watched Mia from the corner of my eye. She had straightened slightly, not hopeful, just steadier. Because this wasn't about vindication. It was about structure. Lucas continued, still calm. All referenced materials are included in the appendix, he said, along with correspondence from the review process. Correspondence, another word that changes rooms. Someone asked, carefully, who conducted the review? Lucas hesitated for half a second. Not because he was unsure, because timing matters. He glanced toward the edge of the pavilion, toward Evelyn. She hadn't moved. She didn't nod. She didn't signal. She didn't need to. Lucas turned back to the group. It went through standard federal verification, he said. Cross-agency. That was enough. You could feel the mental math happening, which calls would need to be made, which assurances no longer held. No one looked at Evelyn. Not yet. This wasn't the reveal. This was the shift. The point where emotion exited the room and process took over. One of the Holloways tried to recover, leaning into a practiced smile. Well, he said lightly, it's good to know things are being looked at closely. Lucas returned the smile, polite and neutral. They always are, he said. He stepped back, returning the remote to its place. The presentation moved on, but nothing else did. Because once data replaces narrative, the story belongs to the system. And systems don't argue, they proceed. I watched the Holloways retreat into quiet conversations, voices low now, eyes darting toward the exits, toward their phones. I watched Mia breathe out, just once, steadying herself, and I watched Evelyn, still standing where she had been from the beginning, unannounced, unmoved. This is the moment most people misunderstand. They think power showed up when the truth was displayed. It didn't. Power showed up long before that in the preparation, the review, the discipline to let evidence speak. Lucas didn't win the room by being louder. He won it by being exact. Because in the end, feelings fade, arguments unravel, but records remain. And once the system starts paying attention, it doesn't stop just because someone is uncomfortable. That's the moment the game changes. Not when someone speaks, but when the data does. No one announced who Evelyn Carter was. There was no pause in the program, no microphone handed over, no dramatic clearing of the throat. That's what most people expect when a secret is revealed. This wasn't that kind of moment. It started with silence. After Lucas stepped back from the screen, the room didn't return to normal. Conversations didn't resume where they'd left off. People didn't relax. They recalculated. One of the Holloways checked his phone, then checked it again, slower this time. Another leaned in toward a colleague, lowering his voice instinctively. Not because someone told him to, because something had shifted. The data hadn't accused anyone. It hadn't named names, but it had narrowed the space. When systems tighten, people feel it before they understand it. Someone near the front asked a question that sounded harmless. So who oversees this review process? The question wasn't curiosity, it was triangulation. Lucas answered without emphasis. It goes through federal verification channels. Federal, that word doesn't land emotionally. It lands structurally. You could feel the ripple small, controlled, contained. Eyes moved, postures changed. No one looked toward Evelyn yet. Not because they didn't see her, because they were starting to realize they should have. The Holloways had stopped smiling, not abruptly, gradually, the way people do when they sense a door closing somewhere behind them. One of them spoke again, carefully choosing tone. Well, it's good to know we're aligned with compliance. Aligned. A word meant to restore balance. Lucas nodded politely. Alignment implies two sides meeting in the middle. This wasn't that. This was one side discovering the other had always been there. I watched Evelyn. She hadn't moved from her spot near the edge of the pavilion. Her hands were relaxed at her sides, her gaze steady, but not fixed. She wasn't watching the Holloways. She was watching the room because she already knew how this part worked. Someone finally asked the question that had been forming quietly in several minds. Who signed off on this? The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. Lucas hesitated again just long enough to let the question breathe. Then he answered. It cleared through the regional verification office, he said, with final oversight. Final. That's the word that changed everything. Not because it revealed a name, but because it confirmed a hierarchy. People don't panic when they hear about authority. They panic when they realize they've already passed beneath it. The Holloways exchanged glances now. Quick. Tight. One of them turned, finally scanning the room not for allies, but for reference points. That's when his eyes landed on Evelyn. At first, there was no recognition, just confusion. She didn't look important. She wasn't positioned like a decision maker. She wasn't surrounded. Then something clicked. Not because she announced herself, but because memory caught up. The questions from earlier, the calm, the way she'd listened without interrupting, the way she hadn't reacted when they'd spoken freely. You could see the recalculation happen behind his eyes. It's subtle when people realize they've misjudged power. Their faces don't fall. They still themselves. He looked at her again, longer this time. Evelyn met his gaze briefly. No smile, no challenge, just acknowledgement. That's when he knew, not who she was exactly, but what she represented. And that was worse, because you can argue with a person. You can negotiate with a title. You can't negotiate with a process that's already finished its work. The Holloways didn't confront her. They didn't apologize. They didn't dare. Instead, they shifted into containment mode. Phones came out. Messages typed quickly, then deleted. Voices dropped even lower. The room had changed shape around them. Evelyn hadn't said a word. She didn't need to. Her authority wasn't something you could hear. It was something you felt once you realized you were inside its boundaries. Someone else asked, cautiously, "Is there anything further we should review?" Lucas answered calmly, "All materials are already on file," he said. "If follow-up is required, the process will continue." Will continue. Not might. Not could. Will. That's the difference between power that persuades and power that precedes. I saw Mia then. She had moved slightly closer, not into the center, but out of the shadows. No one acknowledged her yet, but no one dismissed her either, because once systems activate, the people who carry truth become visible. Evelyn took a single step forward, not toward the Holloways, toward the exit. That movement said more than any reveal could have. She wasn't there to watch them fall. She wasn't there to enjoy recognition. Her work was already done. As she passed by, one of the Holloways spoke her name quietly, not loudly enough for the room, just enough for himself. Evelyn didn't stop. She didn't correct him. She didn't confirm anything, because by then, it didn't matter. Her identity had already done what it was meant to do without being spoken. That's the part most people miss. Power doesn't need a reveal when it's embedded in the system. It doesn't demand attention. It creates outcomes. Evelyn didn't win the room. She rendered it irrelevant. Behind her, the Holloways stood very still, surrounded by their own words, now rearranged into evidence. No one clapped. No one gasped. The program moved on, but the balance had shifted permanently. Because once you realize the person you underestimated controls the standards you depend on, there's nothing left to say. Identity doesn't need to be announced when the process already knows your name, and that's how real power works. Quiet. Complete. Let me say something clearly, because I've seen how stories like this can be misunderstood. Evelyn's silence was not the lesson. Her preparation was. There's a dangerous idea people pass around when they've never had to live inside someone else's limits. They watch a woman endure disrespect with a straight face, and they call it strength. They tell you to be classy. They tell you to take the high road. And if you're the one being treated like you're less than human, that advice can feel like a trap. So let's separate two things that look similar from the outside, but are completely different on the inside. Silence as a strategy and silence as surrender. One is chosen. the other is forced. If you stay quiet because you have no power, no options, no safety, no support that isn't noble, that's survival. And survival deserves respect, not lectures. But if you stay quiet because you're gathering facts, positioning resources, building leverage, that's not weakness, that's discipline. Evelyn wasn't quiet because she didn't know what to say. She was quiet because she knew what mattered. She understood something most people learn too late in serious systems. Emotion doesn't create consequences. Process does. And here's the uncomfortable part. Not everyone can play the long game the way Evelyn did. Because the long game requires two things most people don't have at the same time and protection. Time to observe, protection to wait. If you're a single parent working 2 jobs, you don't always have the luxury of silence. If your boss is humiliating you in front of your coworkers, you might not have time to collect evidence. If you're in a situation where you could be harmed for speaking up, silence might not be strategy at all. It might be the only way you get home safe. So if you're listening and thinking, I could never do what she did, I don't want you to hear this story as an accusation. I want you to hear it as a map. Because the point isn't to copy Evelyn's silence. The point is to understand what her silence was buying her. It bought her information. It bought her timing. It bought her a clean record. Evelyn didn't tolerate disrespect because she believed she deserved it. She tolerated it because she knew the people delivering it were careless enough to leave fingerprints. And she knew fingerprints are more useful than insults. That's the line. If your silence is building leverage, it's a tool. If your silence is shrinking you, it's a warning. So here's a practical way to think about it. Ask yourself this, right now. When you stay quiet, what are you gaining? If the answer is nothing, if all you're gaining is more exhaustion and more disrespect, then your silence isn't a strategy, it's a cost. But if you're gaining clarity, documentation, support, a plan, then you're not being passive. You're being deliberate. Evelyn's strength wasn't that she didn't react. Her strength was that she reacted in a way that created consequences. She didn't trade her dignity for peace. She traded her words for proof. And that's a trade only worth making when you know you can cash it in. Because here's another truth people don't say out loud. Silence without a follow-up is just silence. If you never speak, never document, never set a boundary, never build an exit, then silence becomes permission. Not because you deserve what's happening, but because some people interpret quiet as consent. That's why I'm careful with stories like this. I don't want anyone to walk away thinking, I should just endure more. No. What you should take from Evelyn is this: don't waste your energy on performances that don't change outcomes. A heated argument with someone who doesn't respect you won't educate them. It will just drain you. But a documented pattern placed in the right hands that can change your entire situation. If you've ever worked in a place where one person talks the loudest and everyone else walks on eggshells, you know what I mean. That loud person is rarely the one with the most control. They're just the one who uses noise to cover insecurity. Real control looks quiet. It looks organized. It looks boring. It's the email thread. It's the timestamp. It's the policy. It's the report that can't be argued with. That's why Evelyn didn't need to announce herself. The system already knew her language. Now, let me speak to the people who felt angry watching her be dismissed. Your anger makes sense, because disrespect hits deeper when it's undeserved. It hits deeper when it's casual, when it's done with a smile. And if you've ever been in that position being judged by how you look what you wear, what you do for a living, you don't forget it. But here's what I want you to hold on to. You don't have to be silent to be dignified, and you don't have to be loud to be strong. Strength is not volume. Strength is the ability to create a result. Sometimes the result comes from speaking immediately, clearly, and setting a boundary right there on the spot. Sometimes the result comes from walking away. Sometimes it comes from documenting quietly and letting the process do what people won't. The wisdom is knowing which situation you're in. Evelyn knew. That's why her silence worked. Not because silence is always right, because her silence was attached to a plan. So, if you take anything from this section, take this: don't romanticize suffering, don't confuse endurance with virtue, and don't let anyone talk you into believing that being mistreated is a sign you're handling it well. You are allowed to protect yourself. You are allowed to set boundaries. You are allowed to speak up. And if you choose silence, make sure it's the kind of silence that builds something, not the kind that breaks you. That's the difference between strategy and surrender. And that difference changes everything. There's one more layer to this story that matters more than the twist itself. It's not about who fell. It's about who was holding the weight the whole time. Because if you look closely, you'll notice something uncomfortable. The people who were given the most in this room were also the ones who owed the most and acted like they owed nothing at all. I've seen this pattern for decades. There are people who inherit a system, and there are people who build one. From the outside, they can look similar. Same titles, same access, same rooms, but inside, they move very differently. The person who inherits a system grows up surrounded by guardrails they didn't install, connections they didn't earn, reputations they didn't risk their own name to build. That doesn't make them evil. It makes them insulated. And insulation does something subtle to character. It dulls awareness. When things work for you by default, you stop noticing what makes them work. You stop noticing who keeps them standing. You assume permanence where there is only maintenance. That's what I saw in the Holloways. They spoke about projects the way people speak about weather. Detached, certain, casual. They talked about figures without touching the work behind them. They joked about delays without understanding the consequences. They treated compliance like an inconvenience instead of a lifeline. Because when you inherit a structure, it feels solid. You don't hear the bolts creaking. You don't see the hands tightening them every night. You assume the building stands because it always has. People like Evelyn don't have that illusion. When you build something from zero, you never forget how fragile systems are. You remember the nights spent double-checking, the paperwork no one applauds, the rules that look boring but prevent disaster. Builders don't romanticize power. They respect it, because they've watched it collapse. That's why the people who seem to carry the least ego often carry the most responsibility. They know exactly how much effort it takes to keep things from breaking. Here's the quiet irony. The Holloways thought they were entitled to control because the system favored them. Evelyn understood she had authority because she understood the system. That's the difference. Inheritance creates confidence. Construction creates caution, and caution looks unimpressive until it's the only thing holding the room together. When the report surfaced, no one needed to raise their voice. No one needed to accuse. No one needed to perform outrage. The system did what it was designed to do. That's when the imbalance became visible. The people who had been given the most were suddenly exposed as the ones who had managed the least. They weren't malicious masterminds. They were careless custodians. And carelessness is expensive. This is the part most people miss. Being given access is not the same as being capable of stewardship. Being born into influence is not the same as understanding consequence. When something is handed to you fully assembled, it's easy to forget it can be dismantled. Builders never forget. They know every shortcut weakens the structure. They know every ignored warning compounds. They know systems don't fail all at once. They fail quietly, then suddenly. That's why Evelyn didn't need to celebrate. There was nothing personal about what happened next. No victory speech, no moral grandstanding, just rebalancing. The people who inherited the system were confronted with its demands. The people who had always worked within it were trusted to repair the damage. And here's the part that feels uncomfortable to say out loud. The more a system gives you, the more it expects you to protect it. If you benefit from stability, you owe discipline. If you benefit from trust, you owe transparency. Privilege is not a sin. Neglect is. The tragedy isn't that some people start higher, it's that they forget the height comes with responsibility. People like Evelyn don't resent inheritance. They resent negligence. Because builders don't hate advantage. They just don't tolerate recklessness. I want you to think about where you stand in this contrast. Not morally, structurally. Are you maintaining something you didn't build? Or are you building something no one handed you if you inherited a platform, influence, or opportunity? The question isn't whether you deserve it. The question is whether you're honoring it. Are you learning the rules? Respecting the process? Listening to the people who keep things running when no one's watching? And if you're building from zero, hear this carefully. Your caution is not a flaw. Your patience is not slowness. Your insistence on doing things correctly is not weakness. You're not behind. You're anchored. Builders move slower because they carry more load. But when the structure is tested, they're the ones still standing. Evelyn didn't win because she was underestimated. She won because she never forgot what systems require to survive. She knew that authority isn't loud. It's consistent. And in the end, that consistency mattered more than anyone's name, money, or confidence. Because the truth is simple, even if it's uncomfortable. Those who are given the most often owe the most. And those who build quietly are usually the ones paying the bill. When you understand that, the story stops being about revenge. It becomes about responsibility. And responsibility, unlike privilege, always reveals itself eventually. So here's the question I want to leave you with. Not a slogan, not a moral, a real question. Because this story doesn't end with Evelyn. It ends with you, right now, somewhere in your life. You are visible. And somewhere else, you are not. Most people are. You might be invisible at work, invisible in your family, invisible in a room where decisions are made without you. Not because you're incapable, but because no one bothered to look closely. And when you're in that position, there are always two urges pulling at you in opposite directions. One says, speak up, correct them, make them see you. The other says, watch, learn, prepare. Neither urge is wrong, but choosing blindly is. So let me ask you something more precise. If you spoke up today, what would actually change? Would it create accountability or just create noise? Would it lead to consequences or just cost you energy? Sometimes speaking up is the only ethical move. Sometimes it's the only safe one. But sometimes Speaking up too early only teaches the wrong people where to block you. Evelyn understood timing. She didn't confuse being heard with being effective, and that's a distinction most of us aren't taught. We're told to be brave. We're told to be loud. We're told that silence equals fear. But real life is more complicated than advice posters. In real systems, power doesn't respond to volume. It responds to structure. So here's the harder question. If you chose to wait, what would you be building in the meantime? Would you be documenting, learning how the system actually works? Finding allies who don't announce themselves? Or would waiting just mean enduring more of the same because there's a difference between patience and paralysis? Evelyn didn't wait in hope. She waited with intent. Every day she stayed quiet. She gained something: context, patterns, proof. Her silence wasn't empty. It was full of preparation. So ask yourself honestly, if you stay quiet right now, are you getting closer to leverage or further away from yourself? That answer matters more than any advice I could give you. Some of you listening are in situations where silence is costing you too much. Your dignity, your mental health, your sense of self. For you, this story is not permission to wait longer. It's a reminder that you deserve change. And some of you are in situations where speaking up would feel satisfying, but strategically foolish. For you, this story isn't telling you to endure. It's telling you to prepare properly. Because the goal isn't to be right in the moment. The goal is to be effective in the long run. There's another question worth asking. Who benefits from your reaction if you explode? Who wins if you stay quiet? Who wins? Sometimes the system is built to absorb your anger and keep going unchanged. Sometimes it's built to collapse under documentation. Knowing which one you're dealing with is wisdom. This is why I don't believe in one-size-fits-all advice. Always speak up ignores reality. Always stay quiet ignores harm. What matters is alignment. Are your actions aligned with the outcome you want? Evelyn wanted accountability, not validation, correction, not applause, resolution, not drama. So she chose the path that led there. And when the moment came, she didn't need to say much at all. The work spoke for her. That's the part I want you to sit with. If no one defended you today, if no one noticed your effort, if you felt invisible in a room where you mattered, the question isn't, why don't they see me? The question is, what am I building that will eventually make them unable to ignore me? And if the answer is nothing, that's not a failure. It's a signal. A signal that something needs to change, either your strategy or your environment. You are not weak for wanting recognition. You are not wrong for wanting fairness. But how you move toward those things will shape what kind of power you end up with. Temporary power comes from noise. Lasting power comes from structure. So I'll leave you with this. If you are invisible today, what will you choose next to speak, without leverage or to accumulate, until silence itself becomes authority? There's no universal right answer, only the one that protects your future, not just your pride, and that answer is yours to make.